después cerramos, podemos prender las cámaras y las pueden hacer personalmente, si tienen ganas. No sé arrancar. Bueno, ya. Bueno, antes que Mariana arranque, vamos a hacer una breve presentación. Bueno, la doctora Mariana Cabral Oliveira trabaja en biodiversidad y evolución de algas, tiene un doctorado en botánica de la Universidad de Sao Paulo. Desde 1994 trabaja en el Instituto de Biociencias de la misma universidad, convirtiéndose en profesora titular en el año 2015 y jefa de departamento de botánica desde el año 2014 hasta el 2016. Recibió en 2000 la medalla al mérito científico y tecnológico del estado de Sao Paulo, otorgada por el gobernador del estado. En 2003 recibió el premio Jubileo de la Fundación Internacional para la Ciencia y en 2012 el premio Provación. Es miembro de la Academia de Ciencias de Sao Paulo y formó parte de numerosos comités científicos en su país. Además, formó parte del comité editorial del Journal of Ficology desde 2009 hasta el 2011. Fue editora asociada de Ficología desde el 2011 hasta el 2017 y es actualmente editora asociada del Journal of Ficology. También se desempeñó como vicepresidenta internacional de la Ficological Society of America desde el 2012 hasta el 2013 y desde el 2015 hasta el 2017, y es actualmente vicepresidenta de la British Ficological Society. Así que bueno, le agradecemos muchísimo a Mariana por brindarnos esta charla. Cualquier cosa, esta charla también va a quedar grabada en el canal de YouTube de la asociación. Así que bueno, Mariana, cuando quieras arrancar.
Ok, muchas gracias. ¿Conseguem me ouvir bem?
Sí, perfecto.
Okay, good. So thank you very much. I would like to thank the Association of Ficology of Argentina for the invitation, and also Martina and Delfina for organizing everything. And I have to start by apologizing because this talk was supposed to be 2 weeks ago, but I had a personal problem, so I was very happy that it was able to be postponed for today. And now I also have to apologize for not speaking in Spanish because my portuñol is very, very awful. So I can either speak in Portuguese or in English, and I gather that you prefer the talk in English. So I hope you all can understand, but if not, please stop me and ask any questions you have. So this talk was, I gave this talk in last March, at the International Ficological Congress. Maybe some of you have already seen it. And it was, I was invited by Dr. Alejandro Bushman to speak about ficology in South America. So I decided to use this title, From Monte Verde to Current Trends, 14,000 Years of History. So the reason for choosing to talk about Monte Verde is because, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but Monte Verde is an archaeological site very close to Puerto Montt, and the International Ficological Congress was going to be held very close by. So it may be about a half an hour drive from this archaeological site. And the reason that this archaeological site is so important is because it's one of the oldest archaeological sites in Americas, and I think it's the oldest known in South America. And this region was occupied by human populations about 15 to 14,000 years ago. And later it was covered by a swamp. So you can see some pictures here. And this swamp provided a turf-coated geological stratum that helped to preserve not only the stone remains, but also organic remains. So they could find in this area stone remains, but also the remains of wood and other plants. And among those plants, there were several macroalgae. And this macroalgae, they were so well preserved that they could be identified by their morphology. And the remains were dated directly using radiocarbon, and they were quite old. And if you see those algae in brackets here, you have the Spanish, the Chilean name for those algae. They are all used today by local populations. We can also notice here that there is some remains of sargassum. And if you know this region, sargassum does not occur in the coastal area where those algae are common. So they don't know if this sargassum was a floating mass, such as the ones that we have been seeing around the world, of those floating rafts of sargassum that came by the coast, or if it was traded along the coast from the northern regions. So this remains of algae, as I mentioned, they were well preserved. And also another interesting thing is that they were used by humans. Those are the oldest known remains of seaweeds used by humans. How do we know they were used? Because they were found in kitchen utensils, and also they found a sort of a ancient chewing gum, a mascada, which was a mixture of several algal species together with medicinal plants. So the researchers that describe this archaeological site, they truly think that the seaweeds were used by humans as food and as medicinal products. So this talk was actually planned for a broad audience of ecologists from all over the world. So the idea was to present the South American continent to Asian phycologists, or to Europeans and North Americans. So I'm sorry that you probably, of course, all know that the South America continent has a long coastline, about 30,000 kilometers, spanning from 12 degrees north of latitude down to 55 degrees south. And we are surrounded by 4 oceans. In the north, the Caribbean Sea, the Pacific in the west, the Atlantic in the east, and the Southern Ocean in the southern tip of South America. Of course, we all know which countries composed the continent. Sorry. And also, we can talk a little bit about the current systems along the South American coast. So you all know that the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast are quite different, especially because of their current systems. So we know that in the Pacific, the coastline is dominated by the Humboldt or Peru current, which is a cold and nutrient-rich water current. In the southern part here in Argentina, you probably know better than me that we have the Malvinas current that goes along the coast with cold and nutrient-rich waters. But further in the north, in the Atlantic, especially along the Brazilian coastline, we have warm and nutrient-poor waters that are composed by the South Equatorial Current that comes to the coast of Brazil. It splits in two, and following the north coast of Brazil, we have the North Equatorial Current, and moving southward, we have the Brazilian Current that will meet here with the cold and nutrient-rich waters in the south. So as a result of these different current systems, the sea surface temperatures in South America, especially considering the Atlantic and the Pacific coast, are quite different. So we can see that even at similar latitudes, the sea surface temperature is quite divergent on both sides of South America. As a result, also of this current oceanic current systems, primary production is also quite divergent on both sides, especially along the coast of Brazil. So the productivity, the primary productivity is much higher on the Pacific side than on the Atlantic side. Also, sorry, we can see in these figures the regions where we have these major outflux of river systems, the Amazon in the north and the La Plata in the middle south part here, where you have much higher primary productivity because of those river systems. So just to point out the two river systems, and along the coast of South America, we have 27 ecoregions that were proposed by Spalding, which help us to characterize the marine diversity and also the local conditions on each of those regions. So as a result of this difference in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, this difference is reflected in the seaweed floras. So the seaweed floras are quite distinct on both sides of the continent. And in the Pacific region, we have lower species diversity, but higher biomass. While in the Atlantic, we have higher species diversity, but lower biomass. And we will see that will impact on the seaweed aquaculture that is established on the different countries in South America. I will talk a bit about more, I will talk more about that later on. Also, when we look inside, because this talk was supposed to address the phycology in general, not only the marine algae, but also the continental algae. And if we look inside the continents, we have a complete different set of different environments that includes the largest rainforest in the world, the Amazon region. We have desert regions, we have mountain regions, we have all sorts of different types of dried and humid. So there's a very diverse array of environments where algae can be found, and where in most of those inland environments, there is still very small knowledge of the diversity of algae in those environments. So just to give you a few examples, here are some phycologists in the Amazon region. This is Orlando Necki, who is a specialist in freshwater algae working in Brazil. And this is Morgan Vies from United States, also a freshwater algae specialist, and they were in the Amazon region collecting. And we also have this beautiful algae on terrestrial environments. So here is some green algae, some Trentapolialis growing on the leaves. So there is quite a bit of diversity in the continental environments as well. So if we look at what I wanted to try to answer how many species we have in South America comparing to the rest of the world. So if you look at the algae base data bank, and we see what is known in terms of algae diversity, we can see that the number of species in South America, including the continental and the marine, are smaller than what you find for North America and for Europe and for Asia. So this does not reflect the diversity of environments we have in South America. The reason for the smaller number of species listed for South America is because the diversity in this region, in this part of the world, has been less studied than the diversity of algae in North America and in Europe. So I'm sure that while we study it, we will find more and more species, and our diversity will increase. If we look by country, the known diversity of algae in South America, we can see that Brazil has the highest number of cited species, followed by Argentina, and then the other countries are still poorly studied. And one example is Paraguay. Paraguay, there was a paper that was published in 2020 by Rossetti and Colaboradores. And before this paper, there were only maybe 3 or 4 species described, cited to Paraguay. And this paper listed 900 species of algae in Paraguay. In this case, of continental algae, of course. So there is a lot of places where the diversity of algae have been poorly studied. And one of the reasons that Brazil has this highest number of cited species is because there was an effort in Brazil in the past years to organize the knowledge of not only algae, but also plants, land plants, and fungi in this data bank that is named the Flora of Brazil. And because of this concerted efforts, we were able to have a much better understanding of the diversity of algae and other plants in Brazil. So talking a little bit about the history of phycology in South America. So many authors have described the history of phycology, and usually, and I've cite here 3 important phycologists from South America: Eurico Oliveira, Barnabé Santelices, and Carlos Bicudo. Carlos Bicudo and Eurico Oliveira are from Brazil. Santelices is from Chile. Maybe you know the names. So they wrote before about the history of phycology in South America, and they divide this history in 3 main phases, what they call the explorers and naturalist phase in the 18th and 19th centuries, where you have the initial studies by European travelers that came to South America, collect the samples, and took them abroad for study. And because of that, many types are in Europe. So you probably know when you study, especially seaweeds, usually you have to go to visit the herbariums in Europe to be able to get to observe, to study the types. There was a second phase that was developed in the 20th century by resident phycologists. That means that phycologists that were born and worked in South America. And this work, of course, is mainly in described floras, so it's a taxonomy-based research. But there was here at this time, there was some training of new phycologists. And finally, the third phase, which is the diversification phase, which started in the 60s, is that the increase in number of phycologists led to the diversification of research fields. And I actually named these 3 phases as the exotic, the native, and the speciation phase. So the first work that was that described species of algae in South America. Actually, it was in the Caribbean region. It was in Jamaica. is this book by Sloan from 1707. And he described, in this book, he described his voyage to from Madeira to the Caribbean region. And he collected, during the way, especially in Jamaica, he collected 43 species of things that he described as algae, but some of the things that he collected were actually not algae. They were phanerogams or corals that have been confused with algae. But this is the first time that algae have been recorded for the region. Later, as I mentioned, in the explorers phase, there were many different European travelers who came to South America and collected different organisms, including algae. But one important expedition was the expedition to Brazil by Martius and Spix, which were German naturalists. And they collected many species of animals and plants. And among the plants, especially Martius collected, there were some algae. And he first published a volume on the cryptogams, where he included 80 species of seaweeds. And if you know the work of Martius, you will know that he has these beautiful plates of seaweeds. So here is a plate of sargassum and this red algae, where he gave the details of the morphology and of the reproductive structures. Later on, Martius produced another volumes, including 73 marine algal species and 7 freshwater algal species. Another important expedition was the one by D'Orbigny, which was a French traveler. And D'Orbigny, he traveled to Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay, and he collected many samples of algae, which he took back to France, and these samples were studied by Montaigne in France, which was a medical doctor, but also a botanist. And there were other expeditions that came to South America to collect algae, or to collect organisms and also algae. It's interesting to notice that the first paper that was published in South America was published by a Brazilian, Carlos Chagas. In Brazil, Carlos Chagas was a very important medical doctor because he described some of the tropical diseases. But Carlos Chagas, at this moment, he was interested in microbiology. So he described many different forms of unicellular organisms, including some microalgae. So he has these very nice plates where he shows the divisions of these organisms, and some of those organisms were microalgae. So this is the first paper that was actually published by a South America, in South America, living and working in South America, that had some information on microalgae. A bit later, Spegazzini, which was a scientist working in Argentina, he was actually a botanist. He was interested in higher plants, in land plants, but he also published some work in microalgae, and he published this paper in 1916 on nostoc. So to my knowledge, those are the initial works that have been published in South America that deal with algae. Also, late in the same time, there were some work published by American naturalist Michael Hall, who worked in New York, the New York Botanical Garden, and he published The Marine Algae of Peru in 1914. A bit later, in the 20s and the 40s, there was an increase in the number of scientists working with algae. And those are actually the Secta and Frangeli in Argentina and Legión Oliveira in Brazil are actually the true pioneers of Latin American phycology, because those researchers, they were phycologists. They worked their whole careers studying algae. So the other researchers before that I showed before, Carlos Chagas and the others, Pegazzini, they were working on other things, and they eventually studied some algae. But these guys here, they were dedicating their whole lives and careers studying mostly microalgae. As you can see in this this time of this period, there was quite a bit of interest in microalgae. From 1950 onwards, then we have what we call the cornerstones of phycology in South America, that were Ailton Brandão Joly in Brazil, Carmen Pujals in Argentina, Guajera also in Argentina, and some others. And these phycologists, they were really pioneers, and they were really important, especially in training a whole new generation of phycologists. This was the period where we have the first labs that were dedicated entirely to phycology. Carmen Pujals, as you probably know well, she was a very important scientist, a true pioneer. She was one of the first women scientists that went to Antarctica. And in this period of time, this is when in the 1960s and 70s, this is when the graduation courses begin to be better organized in South America, and funding agencies were established in different countries. So this led to a sort of a more stable environment for science in general. And because of this stability, there were more students being trained in phycology. So many of the phycologists that we see today that are still active some of them were trained by these original generations, but they on the other hand have trained our generation. So my generation has been trained. I'm sort of the grandson and granddaughters of these generations of phycologists. So as I was mentioned, from the 70s, 80s onward, there was an increase in the number of phycologists working in South America, which led a diversification of research fields, and also the organization of the first national meetings dealing with algae, exclusive meetings dealing with algae, and the establishment of the national phycological associations. So in terms of the national phycological associations, the oldest one is was funded in Brazil, the Brazilian Phycological Association in 1981. The next one was actually the Associación Argentina de Ficología, as you know well. Then we have the SOFILAC in 1993. Chile has been very important because Chile had the first National Congress on Phycology, which was in the 80s. I think it actually was 1979, but they took a while to establish the Chilean Phycological Society, which was established much more recently. Other countries have been trying to establish associations as well, such as Ecuador, and also there is this young phycologists Latin American network, but I didn't get much information on that. So one of the things that I proposed to do was to try to find how many phycologists are working in South America. And that was a very difficult task. So in 1985, Carlos Bicudo from Brazil, he made a review of phycology in Latin America, and he estimated at that time that were maybe 100 plus phycologists working exclusively on algae. So I did this search in the beginning of this year, 2021. And in Brazil, we have this, CNPq is the federal funding agency for research. And CNPq has a sort of a curriculum data bank for Brazilian scientists. And I think some Latin American scientists also use this curriculum data bank. And if you search in this data bank using the word phycology, I could find about 230 PhDs, about 165 others, and this others means master degree or technicians or graduation students. And we have about 200 research groups dealing with phycology in Brazil, which is quite an amazing jump from this overall 100 phycologists that were estimated in 1985. So phycology is growing quite rapidly. But if I search the word, the data bank using the word algae, then the number of people that have worked with algae at some point in their careers are much higher. So we have about 2,000 entries of people that have added the word algae in their as their keywords. Okay, if I asked the Brazilian Phycological Society how many members there are, and they told me that they had at most about 350 members around that. So I would estimate that the number of phycologists in Brazil is somewhere between maybe 400, maybe a bit more phycologists working in Brazil, which is quite impressive. From Argentina, I got information from your association, so thank you very much for that. And you've told me that you have about 106 members of the Argentina Argentina Association of Phycology, but you estimate that you have at least the double number of people working in Argentina, so maybe 200 people working in Argentina are phycologists. And in Chile, it was hard to get information, but I got some information from Erasmo Macaya stating that the society, the Chilean Phycological Society had about 130 phycologists. And for the other countries, for example, from Paraguay, Uruguay, I got very little information. And I would say that maybe those countries have maybe 10 or 20 phycologists. Maybe Colombia has a bit more, around like 25, 30 phycologists. So the other countries of Latin American, the number of phycologists are much lower. So you can see that Brazil, Argentina, and Chile have the largest numbers of phycologists, and this, of course, will reflect on the studied diversity that I showed you before, and also on the published papers that I will show you next. So I also want to see what is the contribution of publications. And I could use many different sites, but I decided to use the Web of Science for that. And so we can see that until the 90s, very little was being published on index journals in terms of phycology. So these are the publications, the number of publications per year from South America that had at least one of the authors had the address in South America. So we can see that until 1919, little was done, but then the number of publications started to increase significantly in the past years. So we are doing more and more research. And this, of course, it's an underestimation because this graphic just showed the indexed publications. And we know that many phycologists in South America are published in journals that are not in the Web of Science. So there is much more publications than that, I'm sure. If we look at the same data, but by country, you can see that most of the phycological publications in the Web of Science are being done by Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. So are the major contributions in published papers. Also, but when we look at the contribution of South America against the world, so the world here is in blue and South America is in red, we can see that we still have, it's a significant, but it's not we still have room to improve in terms of the number of publications worldwide. Also, I tried to look at what kind of publications we have been doing. So as we can see, about half of the publications, we've considered this half here, like plant science, biodiversity, ecology, oceanography, environmental, marine, freshwater. About half of the publications is dealing with sort of more biodiversity-oriented research, while the other half, it's split in many different areas, from aquaculture to biotechnology, including medical sciences, pharmacology, engineering, chemistry, and so on, agriculture. So about the other half, it's sort of more applied research, which I think it's reasonable, but of course we have to remember that quite a bit of the publication that is not indexed in the Web of Science deal with floras, with taxonomy. So I'm pretty sure that this half that deals with biodiversity is probably much more significant in terms of numbers. Also, I looked at collaborations. We can see here that this is collaboration among the different, between South America and the other countries. We can see that the countries that South Americans are publishing with authors from United States and from Europe, which are the highest collaboration. But also we do have collaboration within the countries of South America, but not as significant as we are collaborating with US and with Europe. In terms of seaweed industry and algae industry, so if you look at the marine seaweed, if you look at the seaweed cultivation, we can see that there are some efforts, mostly in the Pacific, especially in Chile, but also some in Peru. There are some initiatives here in Colombia and in Venezuela, some in Brazil, and some in Argentina, of different types of green, brown, and red seaweeds. The brown seaweeds are mostly in Chile, while in the Atlantic we are trying to cultivate mostly red algae and green algae. And this is the number of seaweed exporting, mostly seaweed exporting companies. We can see that in Brazil nowadays, only one company is exporting seaweeds. In Argentina, there are 2. And in Chile, a lot more companies are exporting seaweed products, and also in Peru. And this is actually the reflection of that slide that I showed you before, where we had on the Pacific Ocean, on the Pacific side of South America, we have higher biomass, but lower species diversity. And on the Atlantic, we have higher species diversity, but lower biomass. So what happens is that most of the biomass that's being collected and exported is from natural populations. So there are cultivations, but still a lot of the biomass produced is from natural populations that are collected directly from the field. So the amount of biomass that is present on the Pacific Ocean reflects the higher number of companies exporting seaweed products. Also, if you look at the global picture, Latin America produces about 17% of seaweeds in a global scale. So it's not a lot, but it's quite significant if you think. And I have to tell that all this data was provided by Leila Hayashi, who is a specialist in algal cultivation, and she works in the south of Brazil. She's trying to do the Capaficus cultivation here in the south. When we look at the microalgae production, this review was published in 2014, so therefore not long ago. And they mapped all the places, all the biomass production from microalgae around the world. And we can see that basically there's nothing in South America, which is actually very sad, because if we look at this other paper mapped around the world where there is the highest potential for the production of microalgae, and we can see that South America and probably Africa and Australia are the places where you have a very suitable conditions for the production of microalgae. So we have the potential, but we are not producing microalgae, at least not in the scale that is desired. This review was done only for Brazil, and these authors, they mapped along the Brazilian states where are the research groups working with microalgae, and we can see that there's quite a high number of people, of groups working. We have 94 research groups dealing with microalgae. And also we also have some companies appearing in Brazil, but they're still doing a sort of small-scale microalgae production. But the number of studies in Latin America are quite considerable if you look. This table showed the number of patents, and we can see, of course, that US, China, followed by Europe and Japan, have the highest number of patents considering microalgae cultivation. But Latin America is not too bad. If you look here, there's quite a bit of research being done in Latin America in terms of microalgae. So what are the future perspectives? The foundations are already established in South America, both in terms of humans. As I mentioned, we have quite a bit of human resources working in phycology, and also in terms of infrastructure. Also, we do have an algae industry established in South America. Of course, this will vary from country to country, but there is some industries already established. And algae are used by human populations. So both in the Atlantic, this is a picture of the woman cultivating gracilaria in the north of Brazil. And here some people in Chile collecting brown algae. So this algae, they are used by local populations. Also, in terms of future perspectives, we know well that algae can be a problem, can be a big problem, both in terms of red tides, and not only, of course, in the sea, but also in the freshwater reservoirs. We know that the number of blooms are increasing, and many times that that makes the water inappropriate for human consumption. We also have, this is the sargassum major drifts that are coming, especially in the Caribbean region, but also this is a picture from the north of Brazil. Also, on the other side of the coin, we know that the environments where algae occur are under threat, both the freshwater, the marine, and also the terrestrial environment, the forest, the biomes that harbor many diverse algae. Those environments are under threat, and therefore we are losing biodiversity. We are losing species of algae that we even haven't studied yet. So we are on the verge. Some authors have been saying that we are on the verge of the algae revolution, and there's this really nice paper done by Juliette Brody in 2017. There's also the Seaweed Manifesto that you can check on this website. But algae have been proposed to be a solution for several global challenges, such as clean and renewable energy and food production, the production of nutraceutics, biofactories for medical drugs and other products, mitigation of climate change, also to use in environmental restoration. So there's quite a huge potential in the near future. And if we look at you probably have heard of the global goals for sustainable development that was proposed by ONU. And you can see that there are 17 goals. And if we look at the literature and try to find where algae have been used, we see that for most of those goals, we can have examples of the use of algae to try to meet those goals. So algae are a very important player in this future perspective of humans on Earth. So we need to prepare the next generation to confront the big questions and the environmental challenges. That means the biodiversity loss, climate change, food production, all of that. We can use algae, and we can study algae for dealing with that. We also need to increase collaboration, because many of those challenges, they are meant to be worked by a higher number of researchers working in different fields. We need to have a big effort to describe and map the diversity, especially in the continental environments. We need to compile and systematize data for public use and policy making, and to contribute to the use of algae as a renewable resource in different ways. And one way of doing that is strengthening the Ficological societies. So the Ficological societies, they're very important because they are the places where we can better interact with society and government. So Ficological societies must have this important role to be the bridge between scientists and society, and scientists and the governments. They also can organize and promote training and collaboration in a more efficient way, and also serve as a forum for discussing policy and other actions. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. These are the numbers of people who helped me to put this talk together. I needed to obtain data from many different places. So all these people were, they helped me with pictures or with data. And I would really like to thank the association from Argentina, the Ficological Association from Argentina, for inviting me, and I hope you could understand, and also I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And you can ask in Spanish. I understand Spanish, and I can also try to answer in Portuñol.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Mariana. Una excelente charla. Si querés, puedes dejar de presentar.
Sí.
Así nos vemos todos. Si alguien tiene una pregunta, obviamente puede abrir el micrófono y preguntar o dejarla en el chat.
Sí, pueden preguntar en español, está bien.
Tengo una pregunta. En el gráfico en donde se diferencian los tipos de estudios, están separados las ciencias ambientales de la ecología. Queria saber como havia sido as decisões para separar ambas.
Na verdade, não foi uma decisão, porque o que eu fiz foi uma busca no Web of Science. Entende se eu falar em português? Sim. Eu fiz uma busca, uma busca em Web of Science, e essas categorias foram determinadas pelo Web of Science. Na verdade, são as revistas, as journals, que se colocam em alguma área específica. Então, não foi uma decisão que eu fiz, mas uma decisão que o sistema me apresentou. Foi uma coisa automática.
Gracias.
Hola Mariana, buenas.
Olá.
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta. Cuando veíamos el mapa de las colaboraciones internacionales, bueno, sí, lo mencionaste porque realmente salta a la vista la cantidad de colaboraciones que hay con países del primer mundo, por así decirlo. Yo quería preguntar a qué se debe. Intuyo que quizás tenga que ver con acceso a tecnologías más caras, quizás moleculares, ou a coisa do estilo, pero queria saber isso.
Eu acho que se nós pegássemos qualquer área da ciência, física, química, qualquer área, o resultado seria mais ou menos o mesmo. As principais colaborações entre sul-americanos são com Estados Unidos, com Europa, e eu acho que o motivo é porque esses países estão muitos anos em termos de... Eles começaram a estudar ciência muito antes do que nós, e com isso eles têm um avanço tecnológico de infraestrutura. Por exemplo, na nossa área, como eu falei, muitos dos herbários, os nossos materiais tipos, muitos estão, boa parte estão na Europa e nos Estados Unidos. Então, se você quer trabalhar com taxonomia, muitas vezes você tem que colaborar com um pesquisador da França, da Inglaterra, da Alemanha, porque os tipos estão no museu, no Jardim Botânico, ou no Jardim Botânico de Nova York. Então, assim, existe essa questão de tempo, que esses países começaram a estudar a ciência, a fazer ciência muito antes do que nós, e tem a questão de dinheiro. Eles estão mais ricos, eles têm mais infraestrutura, mais equipamentos. Então, eu acho que isso é geral nas ciências. De modo geral, se você pegar o mapa, vai ser muito semelhante. O que eu acho é que ainda existe pouca colaboração entre os sul-americanos, que eu acho que a gente poderia aumentar muito o nível de colaboração entre os pesquisadores sul-americanos, especialmente se a gente quer, como eu falei, fazer, por exemplo, um mapeamento da nossa biodiversidade, né? Alguns dos ecossistemas que nós temos, eles não estão só no Brasil ou só na Venezuela, eles estão em vários países, e a gente tem que fazer muitas vezes, um time de diferentes países para estudar esses ecossistemas.
Y bueno, y se deriva quizás una segunda pregunta de esto, que bueno, que va un poco con lo que estás diciendo, ¿y qué es lo que nos tomaría alcanzar una mayor colaboración? ¿Qué es lo que falta para eso? ¿Por qué no la estamos teniendo?
Eu não sei. Muito difícil a sua pergunta. Eu não sei por que a colaboração... não é que não existe, existe colaboração. Eu mesma colaboro com muitos colegas do Chile, colaboro com colegas da Colômbia, do Peru. Tenho colegas aqui no nosso grupo que trabalham com pessoas de outros países, da América do Sul, mas... Eu não sei assim, exatamente como que a gente pode... É uma pergunta difícil. Eu acho que uma possibilidade é que as sociedades, a sociedade brasileira, a argentina, a chilena, pudessem talvez conversar mais e talvez tentar fazer um esforço conjunto de aproximar as comunidades, né, de ficólogos.
Está bien. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Ricardo, si querés hablar, estás muteado.
Un comentario, Mariana. Entre las asociaciones que estabas mostrando de Latinoamérica, de Sudamérica, me pareció que falta una que es muy nuevita, que es la de Colombia. Que están ya a partir de, no me acuerdo si fue la última, porque debería haber sido el año pasado el latinoamericano, pero ellos tuvieron el latinoamericano hace 4 años atrás, en el 17, y ahí ya estaban constituyéndose como Asociación Colombiana de Ficología.
Olá, Ricardo, muito gosto de te ver. Então, eu tentei levantar essas informações, eu achei alguma coisa sobre a Associação Colombiana, mas eu não consegui nenhuma outra informação, nenhum outro e-mail, ou site, ou contato. Se você tiver, eu gostaria de ter, porque a minha intenção é fazer eventualmente um trabalho, uma revisão sobre o estado da ficologia na América Latina, e gostaria muito se puder me mandar.
Sí, yo te mando alguna dirección de correo de alguna gente que está trabajando, que estuvo en ese tema. Y bueno, es de Sudamérica, pero en Cuba y en México México creo que tiene la más antigua.
Sim, México tem uma associação. É que eu acabei optando por focar na América do Sul. E não, fiquei na dúvida se fazia Latinoamérica, mas como eu tive muita dificuldade para obter alguns dados, eu comecei tentando levantar Latinoamérica, mas aí eu vi que América Central não conseguia nada, aí tem Caribe, eu falei, não, vou ficar só em América do Sul.
Más fácil. Sí, y mi pregunta también quería saber si has hecho algún análisis así como comparás Pacífico y Atlántico, si podés tener algún análisis de la merma en los estudios taxonómicos. Por lo menos en Argentina hay cada vez menos interés en los estudios taxonómicos y el incremento de todo lo que son otro tipo de estudios, desde los ecológicos, los de toxicología, moleculares, esos...
Não, isso eu acho, eu não busquei dados especificamente sobre a taxonomia, mas eu acho que é um reflexo geral. Brasil também nós temos isso, onde você tem menos interesse na taxonomia e mais interesse em áreas talvez mais aplicadas ou ambientais. Eu acho que isso, de certa maneira, é um processo natural de amadurecimento. Isso ocorreu na Europa, nos Estados Unidos. Então, o início da ficologia aqui foi todo baseado em taxonomia, mas à medida que o número de ficólogos foi aumentando, as áreas foram se diversificando. Tá? O problema que eu vejo é que a Europa já estudou suas algas, eles sabem tudo o que tem lá. Aqui na América do Sul, nós não sabemos, especialmente se a gente for para algas continentais. Existe ainda muito por se descrever, muito por se descobrir. Então, a gente ainda não conhece bem a nossa diversidade. Na área marinha, que eu acho que eu conheço melhor, nós estamos descrevendo novas espécies o tempo todo. Então, assim, a gente ainda não conhece bem a diversidade de algas na América do Sul e, ao mesmo tempo, a gente está formando cada vez menos taxonomistas. Então, e eu acho que isso é geral, não é só nas algas. Se você for ver as plantas, os animais, é a mesma coisa. Então, a gente tem que ter um cuidado especial com a taxonomia, porque para todo o resto a gente precisa saber a diversidade, né? Então, precisa ter um olhar cuidadoso sobre alternativas para isso, como trazer pessoas para essa base taxonômica, né? Para contribuir com essa base taxonômica do estudo das algas.
¿No crees que esos problemas pueden estar asociados a nuestra condición de subdesarrollados en función de lo que te preguntaba Santiago, de que, por ejemplo, hoy en día cualquier estudio taxonómico sobre alguna cosa en particular necesita análisis molecular, cultivos, y nos carecemos mucho, por lo menos en Argentina no hay grandes desarrollos de ese tipo de estudios por cuestión de infraestructura, ¿verdad?
Sim, a taxonomia era uma ciência barata, porque só precisava de um microscópio, né? E basicamente era isso. E agora ela é uma ciência muito cara, porque você, para descrever uma nova espécie, daqui a pouco a gente vai ter que sequenciar o genoma, porque é isso, cada vez mais marcadores moleculares, mais ferramentas, e aí a microscopia eletrônica, enfim. Eu trabalho principalmente com macroalgas, mas eu tenho, às vezes, alguns alunos que trabalham com microalgas, e para descrever uma espécie de microalga, a revista pediu microscopia eletrônica de varredura, microscopia de transmissão, sequenciamento de vários marcadores moleculares, estrutura secundária de marcadores moleculares. Então, assim, a quantidade de dados é tão grande que, no final, você gasta muito tempo e é muito caro descrever novas espécies. Então, é um problema mesmo, bastante sério, e vai ficar cada vez pior, eu acho, se a gente não tomar nenhuma digamos, atitude. Mas, por outro lado, eu falo para os meus alunos que as pessoas, acho que ainda pensam a taxonomia como uma ciência antiga, e hoje em dia ela é uma ciência super moderna, que faz com que o aluno aprenda como ir para o campo, como coletar, como tratar os dados ambientais, os dados ecológicos, toda a parte de caracterização da morfologia, da ultraestrutura, a parte molecular. Então, um aluno que vem para fazer um trabalho taxonômico, ele sai um aluno muito bem formado, porque ele entende de campo, ele entende de microscopia, ele entende de molecular, ele entende de análise de sequências, de bioinformática. Então, um aluno que vem para fazer uma tese com taxonomia, ele é um aluno muito completo, né? Ele tem um treinamento muito completo.
Sim, é verdade.
Sí, yo de vuelta. Bueno, no podía, bueno, reparé justo en lo que decía Ricardo, de que esto de que muchos estudios de taxonomía, o mejor dicho, se había dejado de hacer taxonomía en favor de, por ahí, estudios ecológicos. A mí una de las cosas que me llamó la atención es que en el gráfico de torta había 2% solamente de estudios ecológicos. Quería preguntar una cosa que me quedó, ¿por qué también quizás?
Então, esse gráfico vocês têm que ver com cuidado, porque esse gráfico são de artigos indexados no Web of Science. E a gente sabe que muitas revistas na área ecológica, na área taxonômica, não são indexadas no Web of Science. Então, ele é um retrato bastante incompleto, eu acho. Mas era onde, assim, foi onde eu pude buscar os dados naquele momento, ter um conjunto de dados que eu pudesse comparar, porque, então, assim, eu acho que ele reflete uma certa verdade, mas precisa tomar cuidado, porque ele não é extremamente acurado por causa disso, né?
Y volviendo estamos peloteándonos con Santiago. Con respecto al tema del intercambio y de los trabajos en colaboración, también sería interesante un análisis, porque yo creo que desde hace algún tiempo a esta parte ha habido un incremento significativo en los trabajos en conjunto con investigadores de Europa y de Norteamérica seguro, pero entre Argentina, Brasil o Colombia, Perú, Chile, Uruguay, hay mucha interacción de grupos, de colaboración de grupos, al menos nosotros lo hemos notado en nuestro lugar de trabajo, que desde hace 20 años a esta parte ha habido un intercambio significativo y hemos empezado a desarrollar proyectos en conjunto y trabajos publicando con colaboración con grupos de otros países latinoamericanos y eso me parece que también está bueno, una mirada propia y no tanto, o también con gente de Europa y de Estados Unidos, pero colaborar entre nosotros.
Uhum. Não, se vocês olharem os gráficos de produção, a subida nos últimos 20 anos é muito intensa. Então, eu acho que isso também está refletindo numa maior colaboração. Mas, e eu acho que isso vai aumentar, porque, bem ou mal, as algas, elas são problemas sérios, a gente está tendo no Brasil, e eu imagino que outros países da América Latina, a mesma coisa, onde a gente tem reservatórios de água doce com florações, então isso está cada vez mais comum. Então, elas podem causar grandes problemas, mas elas também podem ser ótimas, excelentes soluções. Então, eu tenho a impressão que nós estamos num momento em que vai haver um interesse cada vez maior no estudo e no aproveitamento das algas como fonte de diversos produtos. Então, eu acho que isso vai aumentar também ainda mais a colaboração entre os países. Eu espero, né?
Perdón, soy el niño que tiene preguntas, pero se me ocurre esto, lo siguiente, ¿no? Justo el otro día yo estoy cursando la materia correspondiente a algas en este momento, y la profe mencionaba que en su grupo de atomeas aún es de mucha utilidad la morfología a la hora de describir y determinar especies. Quizás, no sé cómo uno puede llegar a influir en eso, pero quizás podamos o se pueda avanzar, a ver si puedo articular el pensamiento. Quizás se pueda llevar a que las revistas o que alguna revista acepte descripciones de morfoespecies solamente. Como un primer paso quizás, aunque sea primero, que permita ampliar la descripción de especies que existen en nuestro continente o en nuestra región, y a la vez quizás también permitirnos o acercarnos un poco a esa mayor colaboración. eso quizás se puede hacer, por ejemplo, bueno, no, sí, no sé.
Diatomáceas é um grupo especial dentro das algas, porque tem a carapaça dicílica, característica de cada espécie, então, mas isso não funciona bem para as outras algas, né? Para os outros grupos de algas. Mas mesmo em diatomácea, eles têm demonstrado que algumas morfoespécies, na verdade, são complexos de espécies, né? Então, precisa tomar esse cuidado. Mas, assim, eu acho que, não sei se eu capturei bem, se eu entendi bem sua pergunta, mas eu acho que uma possibilidade é realmente fazer redes de colaboração, por exemplo, formar uma rede de colaboração na América Latina para estudo de... fazer um estudo de, por exemplo, listar as espécies de diatomáceas ocorrendo no continente. Isso pode ser feito em diferentes grupos de algas, pode ser feito com algas marinhas, com algas de água doce e assim por diante. Então, acho que a gente tem essa abertura de tentar formar redes de colaboração nos diferentes países, e eu acho que isso seria bastante útil, especialmente para alguns países, não Chile, Argentina e Brasil, que tem uma comunidade de ficólogos grandes, mas para outros países em que a comunidade é muito pequena, né? Então, se houver formação de grupos de estudos em diferentes campos na América Latina, eu acho que isso pode ajudar, sem dúvida, a aumentar a interação e aumentar o conhecimento que a gente tem sobre a diversidade de algas aqui.
Gracias.
No sé si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta. Yo quería agregar a esto de que estábamos hablando, creo que estamos también en como una especie de revolución con el tema molecular en cuanto a la biología, que muchas cosas que estaban, como que se creían que por ahí eran más estáticas, o así como las diatomeas, incluso se usaban caracteres más taxonómicos que por ahí se pensaba que no cambiaban y que eso determinaba una especie, y ahora con lo molecular todo cambió y se vieron un montón de cosas que no se tenían en cuenta antes. Entonces es muy difícil, como en ese transcurso, seguir trabajando de la manera tradicional porque sabemos que no lo estamos haciendo, no sé, de la manera correcta, o que quizás es algo que no podemos explicar. Así que bueno, es como esto, ir creando lazos y, bueno, colaboraciones para seguir adelante, porque sí, en Latinoamérica, bueno, me encantó la charla de Mariana, por eso la traje acá, porque me parece buenísimo entender un poco qué es lo que está sucediendo en Sudamérica, qué es lo que hay y cuánto más falta de investigar acá, porque sí, tenemos un montón de biodiversidad que no está nada descrita. Pero bueno, muchas gracias.
Yo estoy acá anónima porque no sé por qué no me prende la cámara y me conecté con una cuenta de la cátedra. Soy Silvia Sala, me encantó, Mariana, tu charla, me pareció súper interesante y además, bueno, justamente cuando hablamos, hoy hablar de biodiversidad está bien visto, y la taxonomía no lo está, y son dos cosas que van de la mano. Y lo que planteaba de alguna manera, o lo que se plantea acerca de las técnicas moleculares y demás, la realidad es que con las microalgas la cosa se hace más compleja porque uno necesita aislarlas, cultivarlas, etcétera, etcétera. Pero tampoco podemos quedarnos quietos, digamos. O sea, es como que yo creo que uno tiene que poder transitar caminos de alguna manera paralelos para no quedarse estancado cuando uno no puede tener las cosas completas, ¿no? Es cierto que las revistas hoy te exigen, con las diatomeas todavía en buenas revistas podemos seguir trabajando con lo morfológico, porque de hecho la información que hay a nivel molecular de las diatomeas es no sé, 1% de lo que se conoce desde el punto de vista morfológico. Entonces, si aún seguimos encontrando nuevas cosas desde el punto de vista morfológico, hay mucho por hacer. Pero bueno, me encantó la charla y te felicito porque es una mirada muy, muy interesante y que pocas veces nos detenemos, digamos, a pensar globalmente, digamos, en cuáles son nuestros problemas y cuáles nuestras dificultades. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Gracias por suas palavras, muito obrigada.
No.
Quería agregar algo. No me había presentado, yo soy María de la Casco. Mucho gusto. Con respecto a la temática que estamos hablando, los trabajos ecológicos con los pocos conocimientos de nuestra biodiversidad tienen serios problemas también. Hay mucho hecho en grupos morfofuncionales, se trata de buscar la vuelta para tratar de hacer estudios ecológicos, pero muchas veces la necesidad de ese soporte de los taxónomos es realmente un problema. Sabemos que estamos diciendo, dando nombres y con dificultades tratamos de no hacerlo porque no tenemos el bagaje para sostenerlo. Así que yo creo que cualquier ecólogo sabe que los trabajos taxonómicos, como sea, con la dificultad que sea, tienen que seguir manteniéndose para América Latina.
Não, sim, sem dúvida, porque eu entendo perfeitamente. Mesmo para taxônomos, muitas vezes é difícil nomear as coisas corretamente, imagina para os ecólogos. Então, é aquilo que vocês falaram, tem que ter algumas soluções alternativas, paralelas, para tentar minimizar essa questão, né? Mas eu acho que as colaborações podem ajudar nisso também, né? Então, você ter taxonomistas colaborando com ecólogos, colaborando com pesquisadores de outras áreas, podem enriquecer muito os trabalhos, né? Ricardo, você está mudo.
Sí.
Yo quería, además, como uno de sus discípulos, María Adela también lo fue, Silvia y unos cuantos más, agradecerte el reconocimiento para el doctor Guerrera, también para Carmen Pujals, pero nosotros somos discípulos directos del doctor Guerrera, y la verdad que fue realmente más que un gran investigador en la ficología, un gran maestro. Y fue un promotor de todo lo que es la ficología. De hecho, la asociación surge por una promoción de él y un estímulo de él. Así que para nosotros es muy lindo haberlo visto citado ahí.
Bueno.
Y yo me acuerdo que Vicudo siempre tiene muy buenos recuerdos de Guerrera por su paso por aqui, por Argentina, e por nosso laboratório.
Sim, Bicudo me ajudou muito nessa palestra. Eu conversei com ele me mandou muitas informações. Então, é digamos, uma fonte viva de muitas informações e conhece muita gente. O professor Carlos Bicudo.
Sí. Bueno, Carlos lo hemos visto por todos lados. Sí, Brasil, sí. En Argentina, en Chile, en Colombia, donde vamos está Carlos, así que es un gran difusor también de la ficología.
São o que chamamos de cornerstones, né? Eu não coloquei a geração seguinte, porque tem a geração que é do Joly, da Carmen, do Guerrera, e a geração seguinte é que tem Bicudo, Eurico Oliveira, Barnabé Santelices, que que foram treinados, você que foram treinados por esses ficólogos que são muito importantes. Eu não coloquei porque aí são muitas pessoas e eu falei,
sí, claro.
não vou conseguir ter todos os nomes e as pessoas vão ficar chateadas, vão ficar tristes, mas...
El árbol se empieza a ramificar mucho.
Sí.
Bueno, si ya estamos de preguntas y bueno, muchas gracias nuevamente, Mariana. Así que bueno, te agradecemos por haber participado y dado esta charla tan interesante y bueno, cualquier cosa, estamos en contacto.
Sim, eu que agradeço muito e foi um prazer falar para vocês e espero que a gente